Hi guys, and welcome to iDrum magazine. My name's Ed Williams and I'm one of the teachers at Tech Music School in Acton in West London. So I'm really excited about what I'm going to be showing you today. This is the first lesson of 6 based on Afrobeat. So we're going to be looking at Afrobeat grooves based on certain kind of things hopefully that you're already familiar with, and the embellishments and fills and phrases and common phrases and fills and all these kind of different things that go to make some authentic Afrobeat kind of grooves. Okay, so the first lesson is going to be coming from quite a simple standing point, and then we just layer on certain embellishments and certain things to really get that kind of authentic Afrobeat vibe going. So the first one, and you'll be able to see this in the notes that come with this lesson, is based on 8th notes in the hi-hat and 4 quarter notes in the bass drum. Okay, so let me just give you a couple of bars of that. So that's pretty straightforward. Hopefully you should be able to throw that out quite easily. Then we start to add the snare drum, which really starts to give this groove character just by adding 3 notes on the snare drum. So here we go. Here's the first groove coming up. So of course I'm adding a few bits and bobs here and there because I've studied all of the different embellishments and I like to add my own little flavour on it, and I definitely recommend that you do the same thing. But the basic groove was, as I started, you've just got these 3 notes on the snare drum, on the of 1, of 2, and then the and of 3. So that's our first groove, and that again is, it's based on this very basic fundamental quarter notes on the bass drum. Okay, so the next one that we've got adds an extra bass drum here and there, okay, and plays a snare drum on the of every beat. So here we go, here's the next one. So there we go, each of these grooves will hopefully kind of spawn a certain amount of improvisation from you, or inspiration as to what kind of things you fancy putting in, you feel like putting in. So the next one, I'll start off just with nice closed hi-hats, and again we're back to quarter notes on the bass drum, but then a slightly different snare drum pattern. So just have a look at this and spend a few bars just playing around if you want to just play the snare drum pattern on its own, or you want to just kind of play the other parts whilst listening to the snare drum pattern, just spend your time just getting it nailed. Okay, here we go. So that's a really cheeky little number. I really like that one. And when you start to open up the hi-hats on the downbeat of each one, again, that's quite an Afrobeaty kind of stylistic trait to pop in there. Now, as I was playing it, I was thinking, okay, what else could we do to this to just make it sound slightly different without taking the rhythmical essence of the tune? And some very nice easy things. We could just lower the dynamic down a bit and put the crossed cross stick on there instead of the snare drum. So this is how it might sound. So you've got exactly the same groove, but by bringing the dynamic down, changing the sound source here and there, you can really change the nature of the groove and how it fits in with a certain section of the song. You can also experiment with moving the certain hits around the kit. You might want to consistently put the first one on the hanging tom or the third one on the floor tom, and of course feel free to experiment with all of that. So let's move on to the next groove. Okay, and we've got, again, a slight different alteration on this kind of bass drum pattern. We're going to have quarter notes, but the second and the fourth one are going to be anticipated by the previous 16th note. So you're going to have, if I just do the hi-hats and the bass drum, what you've got here is. So that's the hi-hat and the bass drum. And then when we put the snare drum across, so that's the basic pattern. Okay, I want to add a couple of little things in there just to help it kind of move, and it might help it to fit in with what else is going on. So there we go, we've got that groove there. It's a really nice one, but you do want to look out for this second snare drum hit that lands with the anticipated bass drum. Okay, and the very last snare hit also lands there, and it's very easy to flam or to get them unsynchronized. Okay, so the bass drum might be a bit early or the snare drum might be a bit early, and it just starts to make it a bit messy. So you want to have that control there. If you want to do that and you want to make it loose, well then have the control to do it. But first of all, focus on making sure that that second and the last snare drum, the fifth one, is really synchronized with the bass drum. So make sure that you've got that down. So this brings us to the last groove based on that first fundamental one, and then we'll move on to a different fundamental with a bunch of grooves after that. Okay, now this one coming up is a real favorite of mine and incorporates the double bass drum. So by that what I mean is the first two 16th notes of a beat is going to have a double bass drum here and there. So here we go. I'll jam it out a few times and then we'll analyze it a little bit more. So I particularly like playing this one a little bit faster, especially when it's only got the offbeat on the hi-hat. But let's slow it down and just see if we can kind of make it cook when it's a little bit slower. So there we go, I kind of played around with the dynamics, bringing it down, getting it down to the cross stick, picking it back up. But underneath all of that, the groove pretty much stayed the same, with definitely the phrase line, do-do, da-da-da, do-do, da-da-da, that kind of thing stayed exactly the same. And then I just play around with it and just see what's going on. Okay, so now we're going to go into the second half, which uses a different fundamental underlying groove. Okay, so instead of having the quarter notes all on the bass drum, we've actually got a bass drum on 1 and 3 and a snare drum on 2 and 4. Okay, so it's just like what I tend to nickname rock beat number 1. So it's like this. So that's our fundamental groove, and again I think that's a pretty straightforward one to work from, and it's quite accessible as well. So the first groove that we've got for getting that Afrobeat vibe layered over the top of this is adds an extra bass drum on the hand of 1, on the hand of 3, and doubles up that snare drum. So again, the 2 16th notes, and this you'll see is a reoccurring theme. We tend to get these kind of double 16th notes cropping up all over the place. So here we go. So there we go, there's our first main groove with me just kind of messing around, putting a few little takes on it and throwing a few things around and just seeing where I want to go with it. So of course in a musical setting, the bass player might be just giving you something really juicy that you just want to nick and you want to throw that around the kit and just see and vibe off it and you know, match him and just give him a few ideas and throw it back to him. So the second groove that I'm going to show you, again, it's got that kind of backbeat vibe and pretty simple bass drum stuff, but it just adds a double on the second snare. Okay, so here we go. So there we go, we've got a pretty straightforward groove, but simply by putting that double on the snare drum, it just gives it a completely different vibe, and also one that you just wouldn't find in a lot of other kind of more mainstream styles. You might find that you have a really strong backbeat, and then that second 16th note disappears into being a little ghost note, but that's going to create a very different vibe. Whereas this gives a nice solid 2 16th notes, dada. You know, the 2 notes want to be heard at the same velocity or at the same volume. You know, they come out really nice and strong. It's part of the melody. It's not like a little embellishment on the end. Okay. So the next one starts to get into a slightly more syncopated phrase. Okay. So here we go. Here's the next one. So there we go. So I started off with the main groove, just letting it sit, and then start to add a few things, get a few fills going on there. But you have to be able to look at the phrase or the melodic content within a groove. So perhaps what you might want to do is take the bass drum snare drum line and just write it out as one continuous line, or be able to play the whole thing on just one drum or one sound source that you've got on your kit, and use that and be able to share it out in a different way. So you don't have to stick to the specific combination of a bass drum there, a snare drum here. We can really kind of play around with that, you know. Why does it always have to be a snare drum on that particular note of the phrase? You can definitely turn it on its head and see what you get. Okay, right. So now the last one that we've got is one that I will eventually speed up, but I'm just going to play it at the same speed as the previous one because they're kind of related and they just use a slightly different orchestration. So you can see now how you can take the same kind of phrase line but just orchestrate it slightly different to create a different vibe. Okay, here we go. So this one is one that I quite like to ramp up the tempo a little bit and just get it kind of moving. Again, it's this offbeat open hi-hat, offbeat closed hi-hat. Once you've got the coordination sorted out, you can really start to move along. So here we go. So there we go, that can be a nice little one too. If you've got something that's a little bit more pacey, you can start off with that, maybe ramp it up and get the snare on the go, move it over to the ride, get a few extra fills in, just start to bring it a little bit more improvisational, play around with the different options that you've got. But you can also work on having some really nice low tempo grooves, which gives you a bit more headspace to work on what you've got. So we have seen, I have pointed out that we've got, by adding doubles, so instead of having a single hit on beat 1 or beat 2, whether that's a bass drum or a snare drum, you can just add the second 16th note after it to create a really nice kind of Afrobeaty embellishment there, or addition, to really bring that towards Afrobeat. And playing around with some of the hi-hat accents, getting those offbeat ones, really again ramps it up and moves it forward. And it's a similar thing that I talk about in the contemporary R&B stuff that I've done the previous 6 lessons that I've been doing on contemporary R&B grooves. So you're always welcome to check that out and see how I'm talking about it in that context as well. And you can see also that by moving from the snare to the cross stick and from the cross stick to the snare, you get an instant change in dynamic and vibe, and it really starts to crank it up and get going once you move onto that snare drum. And opening that onto the ride is a really good option as well for sections that are going to release. Okay, so that marks the end of the first lesson. There's another 5 to come, so make sure you check those out. And I've really enjoyed showing you this stuff today. And have a great time. Okay, cheers, bye.